Thank you all for coming. I'd like to announce an event at the Jones Library. At 7 o'clock, there'll be an event called Songbirds of the Northeast. I had the imagining of what crowd would choose botched executions and what would choose Songbirds of the Northeast. So if any of you are so moved, go to the Jones. Thanks a lot to Nat and to Amherst Books. Amherst Books is truly, I think, the center of Amherst cultural life. And without it, this town would be Williamstown. There goes sales in Western Massachusetts, alas, unfortunately. I do appreciate the admonition to turn off your cell phones. And I hope you've all done that. When my son was being bar mitzvahed, the first thing the rabbi said at the service was to shut off cell phones. And you could see everybody was fumbling for their cell phones to find it and shut it off. And he spoke with the authority of God, so people obeyed. And then about 90 seconds into the service, a cell phone rang. And I've never seen a rabbi turn white quite so quickly. It was his. So lest you incur the wrath of the rabbi, hope your cell phones are off. What I want to do is I want to try to do something in three parts. The first part is to give you a little bit of sense of the surround of the book, about what the book tries to do. And then second, what I want to do is I want to read to you a little bit from the book so you get a sense of the prose and the argument. And then third, and most importantly, I would love it if we could have some conversation about the subject. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. The book is called Gruesome Spectacles, Botched Executions and America's Death Penalty. And I recommend it for Mother's Day giving, appropriate. This book purports to be the first comprehensive treatment of the subject of botched executions in the United States. And what the book tries to do is to examine the history of botched executions over a more than 100-year period, and to try to make sense of the way in which botched executions are understood in law, in popular culture, and in the struggle to end capital punishment in the United States. Together with my collaborators, Kate Blumenstein, Aubrey Jones, Maddie Sprung-Kaiser, Heather Richard, and Henry Weaver, 5 Amherst undergraduates, more about that in a minute, we studied every American execution from 1890 to 2010. And determined that just over 3% of those executions were botched. Surprisingly, among all of the technologies used in the 20th century to execute, and here I'll pause and let you contemplate what they were: hanging, the electric chair, the gas chamber, the firing squad, and lethal injection. Surprisingly, among all of those technologies, the most unreliable, the one with the highest rate of things going wrong, is lethal injection. So about 7% of lethal injections in the United States have been botched. We argue in the book that botched executions have helped propel changes from one technology to another over the course of this period, from hanging to electrocution, and from electrocution to gas, and from gas to lethal injection. But yet they played very little role in the overall conversation about whether or not the United States should retain capital punishment. This is so, in part, I argue, because in both law and popular culture, a botched execution is seen as a mere accident, an aberration. The hangman gets drunk. The rope wasn't tied tight enough. I hope that by offering a broad historical overview of the subject of botched executions, we can see more clearly and consider whether there is something of broad significance about the phenomenon of botched executions. Perhaps part of the answer to the question of the significance of botched executions is found in the 8th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which, as you all know, prohibits cruel punishment. As the courts have interpreted the 8th Amendment's prohibition of cruel punishment, they have argued that execution, where it is used, must involve no more than what the courts have called the mere extinguishment of life. And judges have said that when we must execute in a way that is compatible with the evolving standards of decency of a humane society. Gruesome Spectacles offers a chapter on each of the major technologies used in the course of the 20th century. In each of these chapters, I discuss the promises and aspirations associated with each new technology as it has been deployed in the business of state killing. And really, it is surprising how resonant or familiar what was said about the electric chair and then re-said about the gas chamber and then was reiterated about lethal injection. The claims about all of them really sound alike. Each is advertised to be safe, reliable, and effective. This book tells the stories about an American romance with technology, a belief in scientific progress, as that belief in scientific progress plays out in the field of capital punishment. It also tells the story of how that belief in scientific progress was betrayed in each of those technologies. The book describes the cases in which botched executions occur, telling the story of the lives of the condemned and focusing in particular on the crimes that they committed. Throughout, what I hope to do is to tell what I would call a balanced story, not neglecting the pain and the suffering that the crimes imposed on their victims, all the while, of course, attempting to focus on the fate of those that we put to death. To talk about the fate of those that we put to death at this point in American history is to do something, I think, a little bit out of step with where most of the conversation about capital punishment is going in the United States. So perhaps the most important issue surrounding capital punishment is the problem of its risk of executing the innocent. So this book attempts to balance that concern, that appropriate concern, with the fate of the innocent by examining the fate of the guilty. And I think at the end of the day, I hope this book contributes to a conversation about whether 3% is an acceptable error rate in the practices of capital punishment. Now, let me say a word about what just happened in Oklahoma. I had the privilege of being invited to speak at a symposium at Amherst a couple of weeks ago on privacy. And my good friend and colleague Martha Humphrey, in her introduction, mentioned this book, which at that point was forthcoming. And I quipped to the assembled audience how silly it was to write a book about botched executions. After all, nothing about botched executions would interest anyone, and that to write a book that would sell, I should have written a book about privacy. And then Oklahoma happened. Beyond the headlines attending the botched executions of Clayton Lockett, what is crucial in assessing the meaning of what happened in Oklahoma is the context in which it occurred. Today, the death penalty itself seems to be in decline. States such as New Jersey, New Mexico, Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland have all recently abolished capital punishment. And serious legislative debate about abolition is ongoing in Delaware, Kansas, Kentucky, Nebraska, Washington State, and my favorite of all, South Dakota. Public support for the death penalty, while still high, is falling. In addition, the number of death sentences imposed by American courts has fallen steadily over the last 2 decades, from a high of 315 in 1996 to 80 in 2013. And while I'm a math-challenged person, that seems to me to be a steep decline. Likewise, the number of executions, after peaking at 98 in 1999, dropped to 39 last year, partially due to the increased popularity of life without parole and to the rash of people exonerated from America's death row. Use of the death penalty in the United States has diminished to the point that only 15 states handed down death sentences in 2013. So that's roughly less than half of the states that